Okay, so we move to the homing into the Bristol part of my talk. And this is work done with, as I say, the local history groups, remembering the Real World War I in particular that I mentioned at the very beginning. So the local work, the real focused on CO started with an exhibition, Refusing to Kill, which toured various locations in Bristol. And one of the things we were interested in is the numbers of COs in the Bristol area and in Bristol more particularly. So in terms of statistics, I've sort of suggested it's quite murky, but thanks to the Pearce Register of British World War I Conscious Objectors, compiled by Cyril Pearce with help from individuals and groups researching the subject around the country and trying to bring forward this lesser known history of the First World War, and his book Communities of Resistance kind of displays some of the findings of that register. It's a database. So we started our work using the database as it then was several years ago, with the idea of looking at Bristol and surrounding area. So North Somerset, South Gloucester, Somerset, Gloucestershire and Baines. We started with the idea of about 350 COs in our area. As time went on, the database grew and it became 580 in that widely drawn Bristol area. But what has transpired, subsequently focusing on the city with particularly Cyril Pearce's research, is that Bristol was, in his words, special. It was a hotspot as a city, as it was defined in World War I. It was special because of both numbers and his conscious objector index. So in terms of numbers, 427 COs, which places Bristol third in terms of cities behind London and Birmingham. The CO index is a rough calculation by Pearce of the number of COs per 1,000 eligible men. So it uses the 1911 census to calculate in a particular local authority the number of eligible men within conscription age, and then compares the number of COs that have been counted by this gradual discovery process with no central single record of COs. So Bristol becomes special in terms of both numbers and the CO index as a city. And both Cyril and our own work has sort of identified clusters within Bristol, within the Bedminster area, within the Redfield St George area, Bishopston and neighbouring Horfield. And we've begun to investigate them as a group and with others around the city. Particular work has been done on Bedminster. What we did more generally was we investigated Bristol COs, and we worked largely with descendants. We investigated some key people in terms of Bristol, or men COs with a Bristol link, if you like, with their descendants, but also key figures locally and key supporters locally. So I just want to give us a snapshot of this to give a sense of that variety of motivation and of the journey through the war and what happened subsequently. So Walter Ailes on the left-hand side of the screen was an independent Labour Party man, a trade unionist, a congregational minister, and a local councillor in Bristol. So he's probably the most famous Bristol conscious objector. He was also a founder member of that organisation I talked about in the first half of my talk, the No Conscription Fellowship. Early on in the war, he was prosecuted for publishing a leaflet opposing conscription, Repeal the Act. He was also appeared before a local tribunal, was rejected, was picked up, arrested, handed over the military, and became an absolutist objector. So spent the remainder of the war in a prison cell, suffering the sort of systems we've heard talked about, the rule of silence, those kind of things. After the war, however, his path is not what you might expect. He is released in 1919 and becomes elected as a councillor in Bristol again. So far from being rejected by the electorate, the view seems to be rather different. And then a few years later in the 1920s, he becomes a Bristol MP. Next to him, Paul Sturge, in a uniform, but not a military uniform. Paul was a local Quaker. At the beginning of the war, he joined the Friends Ambulance Unit, so a Quaker organisation, medical organisation, and served on the Western Front as part of that when conscription was introduced. As many Quaker Friends Ambulance Unit members felt, he was rather uncomfortable with assisting the military and also thinking what was happening back at home in terms of the treatment of objectors. So he changed tact and went into humanitarian work for the Friends and continued in that humanitarian vein in the voluntary sector after the war. Alfred James was a Mason, a trade unionist, an atheist, and he was an absolutist in prison. He came out and continued in that trade union work. Our central image of three men we used locally to publicise the research we've done, different activities we've run, because it's rather misleading. These are the Whiteford brothers. And we have Graham in the full military uniform with the ammo belt from shoulder to waist there, who was in the army. In the middle, we have Hubert, who is in a, well, it's not actually a prison uniform, it's meant to look like a prison uniform. He was an absolutist conscience objector. And the other side of the photo, Wilfred Whiteford was a conscience objector as well, but one who served in the non-combatant corps. So no ammunition. Frank Merrick was born in Bristol, but actually by the time war was declared was a professor of music at Manchester. He was a vegetarian, a keen supporter of women's suffrage, and a humanitarian. And he was an absolutist during the war, spent his war in prison. He emerged very much in demand from Manchester, professor of music again, and became a very prominent composer, well-known composer. Eric Crompton was working on a farm when he was handed over to the military and placed in the non-combatant corps, which he rejected. He refused orders, was court-martialed, imprisoned, but accepted the Home Office scheme. So the photo you see there is him at Dartmoor, where he was working in the Home Office scheme camp there in the deprisoned Princetown. And then on the far end of the screen, Guildford Wooland was a boot maker from Kingswood, and he also ended up in prison, refusing to cooperate, but then on the Home Office scheme on Dartmoor, and went back to bootmaking afterwards. Eric Crompton struggled to find a job after the war. So we have a mixed picture in terms of how these men fared, but also their choices. And I could talk more we could talk more about the wider effect on some of their families. We worked with descendants. We have that sense of the ripple effect down the generations, and a lot of pride in these men, but also a degree of suffering for some of them. I wanted to talk a little bit about support within the city and strategy and resistance. They're very much an active movement. So we have a photo here of Mabel Tothill, who was a Quaker, had been a suffragist before the war. So had a plenty of experience of organising. And she ran a joint committee which brought together different organisations supporting conscience objectors in the city. So the Conscription Fellowship, for example, Quakers, Independent Labour Party, and other organisations. And locally, there was a lot of activity in terms of different publications. So here you've got some of those examples. What every Bristol man should know there in the middle, repeal the Act, I've referred to already, and the idea of what was happening at Hallfield Barracks, how COs were being treated when handed over to the military. So we have this very active organisation which was monitoring COs, checking where they were, checking their movements around the country, who was being court-martialed, which camps they were at, if they were at military camps, which prisons they were being held at, and sharing information with families. We also have, just coming back to the idea of COs who are on the run and hiding, two really key stories locally reported in the press, that of George Barker and Elizabeth Hutchinson, both of whom were tried and convicted and sentenced for harbouring objectors, harbouring men who were going underground. George Barker in a well or hole or cave, different descriptions, underneath his bicycle shop in the Bedminster area of Bristol, and Elizabeth Hutchinson of the Redland area of Bristol, hiding or employing COs outside the city. So networks of support within Bristol. So I just wanted to finish this Bristol section of my talk by referring you to some of the other sort of work we've done. We've got materials for schools, the pamphlet I've already referred you to, the image of which, front cover of which is on the left-hand side of your screen, range of other pamphlets and a forthcoming book. And we've also got a little bit of work locally but on Second World War conscientious objectors. And there, I think I'll conclude, having given that brief local picture.